Thank you for joining us for this summer course. I hope that we are all in the mood with the sand and shells and waves. I know that I feel very receptive to art and Cape Cod right now. Please join me in welcoming Edith Tonelli.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. I see some friendly faces in the audience and some new people who I'd like to meet after if you have questions. We will open this up to some questions when I finish, and I hope some of the things that I have to say will be a little provocative and perhaps initiate some ideas on your side. I've been asked to give this class, the first one of the 3 classes, and the class has been advertised this way: explore how Cape Cod has been an inspiration to artists, including Blanche Lazzell, Edward Hopper, and Hans Hofmann. You will discover the ways in which the natural and cultural environment inspired these 3 diverse artists and how they felt moved to experiment with expressing the beauty and attraction of Cape Cod's natural surroundings, even when naturalistic imagery ran counter to their personal aesthetics and the art movements of the time. David Thoreau called Cape Cod the bared and bended arm of Massachusetts. And I'm a little bit curious today if there's anyone here who hasn't been to Cape Cod. Anybody? We have a crew of people who have had that experience. This is not a view that we see very often of Cape Cod, but it really helps us get a feel for how this peninsula really has the feel of an island. And as you go out to the outer parts of the Cape, you're really getting to a place that seems very isolated. And certainly in the era we're going to speak of, there was not as much traffic, not as much tourism, although it was beginning to burgeon. So people could find isolation and solitude, especially the artists, in addition to finding a kind of burgeoning colony of artists, other artists to relate to. When I was first asked to speak on these particular 3 artists, Hopper, Lazzell, and Hofmann, I was not sure that exploring their work would reveal enough of the unique history of Cape Cod. However, being forced to kind of lump them together and make sense of their individual production in relation to the special environment of the Cape, it forced me to rethink the legacies of this region and how certain elements that were present and being explored in their time have been transformed and passed on by them. As I have followed some of the research threads in the past few weeks, I've rethought my outline a bit for this talk, so it'll be a little bit different than the handout you may have received. All of the elements that I mentioned earlier on are still present, but I've restructured the presentation to suggest for you the way that some of these traditions have been carried into the 21st century. So I've conceived the talk in 2 parts. We will talk and think about, first, the uniqueness of the place that is Cape Cod and its artistic flagship, which is Provincetown. And then secondly, we'll talk a bit about the broader traditions or legacies that encompass and carry on those aspects of this uniqueness that is Cape Cod. So although the focus today is on the 3 artists, and on the first half of the 20th century on Cape Cod, it will be important for us to understand the ongoing creative traditions of the region that were a part of every artist's experience. Because the unifying element of this lecture is a place, an environment, a milieu. We really are going to be exploring a social and cultural influence on these artists. As your lecturer today, I must tell you a bit about my orientation and my interests. I consider myself an interdisciplinary, social, cultural art historian who has both an MFA and a PhD, plus a master's degree in psychology. I bet you can kind of guess which of those degrees helps me the most when I teach and run a museum. But I have had some wonderful mentors in my career. One of those was Linda Nochlin at Vassar College, who was a specialist in realism and really got me started on understanding the traditions of realism. And then there was Robert Motherwell at Hunter College, City University of New York. I have to say, and I hope you will pardon me, if I add some tidbits from him in this talk, I was quite smitten with him as a graduate student, and it's no surprise to me that someone 50 years younger than he became his wife in his later years. I enjoyed his lectures and talks and his warmth. He was just a pretty amazing person. And also Patricia Hills at Boston University, who helped me understand the social aspects and cultural aspects of art in the United States, especially in the 1930s. And finally, Jonathan Fairbanks, who some of you may know, from right here, as my first internship was here at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts with Jonathan in the American Decorative Arts Department. Of course, when he was here, it seemed like he was running the entire museum, but he's an amazing person, and I have been delighted to know him throughout my life. And then I also was a graduate student, as you just heard, who wrote my doctoral dissertation on the art of the Federal Art Project of the WPA. And this is important because, in my estimation, often that art was really what I would consider art that only a mother could love. Many of these artists felt forced to do certain kinds of art that they really didn't want to do. And yet, the WPA, at the Federal Art Project at least, became a wonderful incubation period for our artists in the 30s. And I really do believe that the 40s and abstract expressionism would not have happened without that incubation period in the 30s. And I'm also someone who spent almost 10 years as a faculty member in what was known then as the Marxist Art History program at UCLA. So I've had some exposure to the idea of the social and cultural history of art, and I feel at home as a museum person as well as a teacher, looking broadly at what influences artists. So I find myself today in this small, somewhat provincial part of the world, trying to make sense of the enormous pull of this peninsula that I now call home. And to this end, I've completed this year, as Jasmine mentioned, this tome with the indispensable assistance of my friend and longtime Cape Cod art critic and art writer, Deborah Foreman, who I think is here. Deborah, are you here? Can't see that well, but she and I created a book in the wee hours of the morning sometimes that highlights the works of art in the collection of the Cape Cod Museum of Art. And I do believe that this is a historic moment for the Cape and for Cape Cod art because our collection of over 2,000 objects is really an attempt to help people understand the history of Cape Cod art. And hopefully with this book, it will also initiate some more gifts and more filling in of some of the gaps that we need to fill in the history of Cape Cod art. So this, for me, the book and this talk even, is a beginning attempt to look a little more broadly at the art that's been produced on Cape Cod, and to explore the art movements and cultural traditions that have influenced and been influenced by this amazing, diverse artistic production. I also, over the years, have found myself moving from a very traditional formalist style of analysis to a understanding in a broader cultural context. Formalist art history is its own world. It's often a very safe and comforting world that can avoid the messiness of daily life, but is often the issues and the problems of an artist's life, the life of a living, breathing human being like us, struggling to find a place, an identity, and a voice. Those messy demands on a life that ring so true when trying to understand the meaning of an individual's creation. Susan Baker, who wrote The History of Provincetown in 1999, illustrated this book in a humorous way, and one of the pages of the book refers to a series of conversations between Jackson Pollock and Hans Hofmann in P-Town that became quite legendary. And I think what she was helping us understand is that these artists in Provincetown had their own relationships, some of them good, some of them not so good, but they related to each other and bounced ideas off each other. And they met people who they liked or disliked and perhaps respected. And I think Hofmann often talked about Pollock in a way that showed his respect for him, even though he was a younger artist. So that social and personal environment can often be a much more powerful influence on an artist's images and painting style than some of those more internal mental constructs that we often think about in an artist's work. Cape Cod has been one of those demanding, messy factors in the artistic production of these creative individuals. So as I thought about how to truly help you discover the rather messy impact that Cape Cod has had on its artists, especially from the end of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th, I realized that without some kind of visceral experience, it would be difficult to communicate to all of you what most of these artists found really compelling. just wanted you to get some of those images. That some of them are more contemporaries, but the one just before the last one, just before the church, was the dunes out in Provincetown, and those of you who have driven out there have passed that many times. And these artists had that experience, not just of driving by, but walking and bicycling and being part of the dunes. This might have been a little bit corny and nostalgic, but I think that nostalgia and the old-fashioned provincial and corniness of Cape Cod is part of its attraction, its sense of place, of belonging, of being a home base, which so many artists have articulated. Robert Motherwell's daughter, Jeannie, remembers his excitement when he began packing boxes early in the spring, boxes that contained his materials and supplies for a summer of painting in Provincetown. As Daniel Rinaldi has written, his delight was obvious to her. The time in Provincetown brought his best productive energies forward, and he was always eager to arrive. Jeannie realized, as she wrote in 2012, he was happiest on the Cape. So since I cannot take you for a walk through the dunes or help you experience the amazing reflective shimmering light or all of the other elements that have consistently built this excitement and this energy for artists, we have begun our exploration this morning through as many senses as possible: sound, images, tactile, if you wish to open your little baggie now, and even smell. I hope you could smell a little suntan lotion in there. And I have a surprise for two very special people. If you happen to get a scallop shell in your baggie, you will win a bottle of Cape Cod air, $1 at the Christmas tree shop. And it is bottled in Middleborough, Mass. I guess we could open it on the Cape and put some new air in there. But you will not only get that, but also for those two people, we'll get a complimentary copy of the new book. And so when I finish, you can come up and get your, do we have two people? Yeah, there's one. Yes. It's pre-order, but you'll get it in the mail. So now that we've had this kind of shared experience, I would like to move on a little bit into this area of the sensual and the immersion in the area and the place that is Cape Cod. The reason that this sensory experience, I feel, is so important this morning is that almost every artist who's talked about his or her experience on Cape Cod has emphasized the sensory part of that experience, the unrelenting insistence of the natural environment that caused them to get outside, to look outside, to explore, and truly feel the outside. The three artists who were the focus for this course, Hopper, Lazzell, and Hofmann, had very different styles and visions, but they were all affected by living on Cape Cod, and so was their art. It may not be surprising for you to discover that Hopper and Lazzell had a strong connection to Cape Cod. Their imagery is often a direct reflection of their surroundings. Blanche Lazzell's My Wharf Studio from 1932 in our collection, and Edward Hopper's Cape Cod Morning at the Smithsonian. Both are clearly part of their experiences on the Cape. Hofmann's connection, however, is not so visually obvious. Surprisingly, what we do know is that the Cape Cod environment was a great inspiration to Hofmann and many of the abstractionists that worked with him. An important and fascinating bit of information about Hofmann's life on Cape Cod was first recorded in a slim but significant volume published in 1977, Cape Cod as an Art Colony. April Kingsley, writing in the introduction, which she called An Embarrassment of Riches, commented, "As for Hofmann, his working time, especially during his early years in this country, was primarily the time he lived on the Cape. He went all over the Wellfleet and Truro Hills in a big Packard touring car, the top down and the back seat completely filled with gear, including an outdoor easel that he would weigh down with 2 gallons of water, drinking water. He would go out there and, as he would say, just swim in color and the landscape forms." This was him out on the dunes. "He had about as deep an identification with the landscape as a person could have, never missing a sunset or an opportunity to immerse himself in it." He's painting on the dunes in 1939, a wonderful photograph by Herbert Matter. This is a landscape of Hofmann's, Untitled 28 in 1936. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing that this is the kind of landscape that he would paint from the top of this summit of the dunes that he was painting from and looking down into the bay, especially to the Provincetown Bay. And it just, to me, shows how he really immersed himself in the landscape and what he was seeing around him and the colors that he saw. Immersion, as Hofmann said, to just swim in color and the landscape forms. The Cape environment surrounds you and stays with you when you leave to go into the studio or back to the big city of Boston or New York. The Cape has a diversity of environments: pine forests, dunes, lakes, ponds, shady-lined streets and quaint cottages, the ocean quietly lapping or furiously pounding on the rocks. As you drive or walk or bicycle, a wrong turn down a narrow road almost always takes you to some kind of sparkling, reflective pool of water, fresh water, marsh, or ocean, and to a picturesque vista or a cozy cul-de-sac. And the outer Cape, especially, has seemed magical to many people. Stephen Porkowski, in the foreword to The Tides of Provincetown, has written, "Some believe that the spiraling form of this farthest outpost of Cape Cod creates a unique form of energy that attracts and sustains creative people." I don't know if that was a little tongue-in-cheek, but this is for some of you who, most of you maybe know if you've visited, but I don't know if I can work this thing. It doesn't work very well. The spiral on the Cape is something that is mesmerizing at times and also fools your GPS a lot. your own personal direction, but also the GPS, where you are going west and then you're going north and then you're going east, and you're surrounded by water and dunes, and if you lose your way, you can end up in the south and thinking you're in the north. And even, I think, for those of you who've driven along 28 or 6A, it often goes from you're going east to then you're going 6A north to you're going west. And I do think there is something kind of special about that. When I lived on the West Coast, I always thought of, okay, the ocean is on the west. And when you live here, it's in the east. But when you're on Cape Cod, it can be anywhere. So I do think that it's got a special energy, and maybe it doesn't necessarily actually attract certain kinds of people, but I do think it has an effect on you when you're living there and walking around there. It's a unique geological formation with a town at the end, And it's the town at the end, Provincetown, is less than half the size of Manhattan and fewer than 10 square miles. Robert Motherwell once again made a case for the specialness of Cape Cod and Provincetown when he wrote on the quality of the light. He said, "People tend to forget that Provincetown is roughly on the 42-degree meridian, as is Barcelona and Rome and Macedonia and Istanbul. A distinctly warm southern light compared to Northern Europe, a light as seductive to painters in the modernist tradition as geometry was to the ancient Greek philosophers." Borkowski from Tides of Provincetown continues, "The geography does much to define the experience here. The light, the water, and the sky contribute to the mysterious alchemy that allows the mind to think unfettered and to work unencumbered." Until the late 19th century, Provincetown had been virtually an island, accessible by and tied to the sea. A railroad finally linked it to the rest of the world in 1873, easing the way for artists, writers, and visitors to explore the landscapes and seascapes. Some writers have suggested that the harshness of life at the edge of the ocean made Provincetown more accepting of others coming in. The rest of the Cape has been a more conservative from its colonial roots. The economics of a rustic fishing village with a tolerant local population of hardworking Portuguese fishermen and women allowed artists to live initially, at least, with relatively little concern about their livelihood. I appreciate how Deborah Foreman has expressed the specialness of Provincetown in her book, Perspectives on the Provincetown Art Colony, that she wrote in 2011. She says, "Distinctly different from the rest of the Cape, Provincetown sits at the end of the peninsula, a little outpost, separated from the more populous areas of Yankeedom. Remote as it is, it attracted a hardier, more independent person, miles apart from the staid English and puritanical influences that gave other towns on the Cape a conservative inclination. Provincetown is marked by its Portuguese population's welcoming of the anti-establishment artist and writer who came here to work and play. Nowhere else on the Cape is the light so brilliant, and nowhere are the people so willing to accept the droves of avant-garde who have made their way here. It is a place that cradled the freedom to experiment, championed new ideas, and challenged many to be different, to be creative, even outrageous, which is often what an artist is." Whew. All that, and the opportunity for solitude, too. What more could an artist want? And I just want to point out where we are when we're talking about Provincetown. We're really talking about this swirl right here, from here on. And then the outer Cape itself is, if you're thinking of the arm, the outer Cape is this part here. So that includes Orleans and Truro and Wellfleet and Eastham and a few other small areas. This kind of specialness that Cape Cod represents for artists reminds me a little bit of Sex and the City. One of the taglines for this HBO hit, Sex and the City, is where the city of Manhattan itself is considered the fifth major actor in the series. And even in the episodes where the action takes place out of the city, in those cases, the energy of the city, even more obviously, is present because it is absent. So in the same way, no matter what style or materials were chosen by these artists, the attraction of Cape Cod and Provincetown was full and comprehensive, a combination of a unique place with the sensory experiences that we've just talked about, a social milieu, key players who really were the personalities of Provincetown and the Cape, and then the broader cultural legacies, which we'll also get into. The place itself includes the pull of the natural world, the attraction of the social milieu, the personal history of these key players, and the diversity of the cultural history on this somewhat isolated, slower-paced spit of land. So, since this is such an embarrassment of artistic riches, according to April Kingsley, where do we start to understand and appreciate this history? We could run through the list of artists chronologically, as we have in our Art from Cape Cod, as many art historians have done. But since I come to this study as an artist and a curator, as well as an art historian, I have a strong desire to understand this history, and especially Cape Cod's contemporary artistic trends, from a more thematic structure. Is Cape Cod unique? If so, what's made it unique? If not, what does it have in common with other American coastal colonies? I do believe that Cape Cod and the Provincetown colony are unique, and that the uniqueness is formed by this combination of these four factors. So now we've had a taste of the first factor, the sensory factor of the natural environment, the spiral spit of land with water surrounding it, that causes light in the sandy dunes and the unrelenting waves to reflect the light in almost a snowy whiteness. It confuses the east, west, north, and south of finding your way. And it mesmerizes, as Robert Motherwell has said, with sound and smell and wind, especially on a stormy day. This together is unique and compelling. But what about the second element, the social environment? We can dismiss up front the idea of Cape Cod's artistic beginnings as unique. There is a long history of art colonies by the sea in Europe in the late 19th century, of Americans creating European art colonies for their own refuge, and of expatriates returning to the States and recreating their experiences along the coasts. In fact, John Singer Sargent was an American abroad in England, painting out of doors with friends in the 1880s, creating their own informal colonies. This is John Singer Sargent's painting of Paul Helieu sketching with his wife from 1889. And I will bring this up again because I think it's a very important landmark painting that shows how artists had changed the way they paint and how they had literally dug into the environment, and their paints and their canvases are right in the grass. And the ideas moved home to somewhat isolated summer retreats in coastal areas, especially in New England. This is a photograph of an artist colony. If anybody knows Millway Beach and Barnstable Harbor, well, every time I see this, it reminds me of that area of the Cape. But if we look at some of these photographs from these early colonies, we listen to the descriptions of the writers, we might easily mistake one for the other. This photograph, undated, but probably from the early 1900s, has all the elements of any of the New England art colonies, and the descriptions sound familiar to any who have read about Provincetown and its history. Quote, "Of the many painters who passed through the community in the years between the world wars, few escaped without internalizing a sense of place, compounded by a new way of seeing. And again, by the time of World War I, the picturesque fishing village had become nothing less than a contested terrain in an ideological conflict between artists who traded on the regionalist image of old New England and those having a modernist worldview. Both camps, traditionalists and the avant-garde, Bostonians and New Yorkers, found a ready home in this place. This unique geographical and historical features of the place held sway over a broad spectrum of visitors. But guess where this is? Sounds like Provincetown, but it's not. It's Algonquin in Maine. That was Thomas Denenberg writing about Maine and the artist colony that was begun in 1898, a year before Charles Hawthorne started the colony in Provincetown. These artist colonies were very similar, although the terrain was somewhat different. I love these photographs of these portraits of these great artists who ruggedly paint out of doors on the rocky cliffs, but they don't go anywhere without their pipes. There are so many of these photographs with men smoking pipes. Was an important part of their, I guess, of their identity and their savoir-faire. There were these colonies in Maine, and in the Connecticut coast, Cos Cob and Old Lyme. But most of these colonies, the other ones in Maine and Connecticut, definitely waned after the First World War. Provincetown was different. It not only survived through the world wars, it thrived. It was named in 2012 the longest-running continuous art colony in the United States. So we know there's something special and unique about this place and its longevity. I today am postulating two reasons that combined do make Provincetown unique as a social milieu, and I believe have affected its longevity and the creativity of its artists. Their ability to combine and use the history, traditions, and cultural ideas that have passed through it. Number one is its geographic placement. And I don't mean this in a geological way. I mean it as between the two thriving metropolitan areas that had very different cultural traditions, Boston and New York. Boston was representative, at least in the early years of the 20th century, of a more conservative, realist Boston school of painters, whereas New York was representing the more modernist trend. And these issues became very heated in Provincetown, and it really sat in between. You could get there from both New York and Boston fairly easily. And number two, I think, is really important, which is its access to more isolated areas. You don't have to go very far from Provincetown, and certainly not in those days, to get to a quiet, deep, dune-like setting. The areas that were more isolated, such as Truro, Wellfleet, even the Mid-Cape and Woods Hole, were frequented by some of these artists. It's allowed artists to get away from the bustle of the rowdy gatherings, which there were many, the all-night parties, the galleries, which were very often putting pressure on the artists, the visiting art students and tourists who came all the time, especially in the summer, and often even the silent or not so silent criticism from others. Remember that Jackson Pollock Hoffman cartoon? They were constantly feeling the criticism and the judgment of other artists. So to be able to take a walk and get out of that environment, or to rent a little cottage in Truro instead of having to live in Provincetown, I think made the difference in Provincetown in terms of the ability of artists to be able to get away if they needed to. They could choose. They had a choice, really, on a daily basis to commune or not to commune. Someone like Edward Hopper loved the coast of Maine and the North Shore of Boston, but he returned summer after summer to his little isolated studio in the dunes of South Truro. Ron Kukta, in the 1977 catalog Provincetown Painters, saw Provincetown not so much as a cultural center, but more as a good working place for artists. He felt there was something about the intense sunlight that reflected off the sea and the dunes for the Impressionists, the fraternity of artists and the picturesque subject matter for the Realists, the energy of nature and the existential apartness and solitude for the abstract expressionists. And he believed that that had a lot to do with their the artist's vitality in this town. Now that we've explored two of the elements that I believe make Cape Cod unique, how do the individual artists each come to this environment, interact, and create, transform, and be transformed? This is where we can return to a somewhat chronological exploration, because there was a kind of progression that took place, especially because of the importance of the long-running nature of the various schools of art. As we are here to focus on three artists in particular, Hopper, Blanche Lazzell, and Hofmann, we are going to follow three threads that we can pull out of this era and out of each of their experimentations. Although this type of construct sometimes simplifies the human complexity that is each artist's individual journey and how they got there, it also can help us categorize better the legacies of these artists. For Hopper, we will call it post-impressionist realism or modernist realism. For Lazzell, we will call it Fauvist cubism. And for Hofmann, we will kind of reverse the obvious abstract expressionism and call it expressionist abstraction. Because I think sometimes abstract expressionism just kind of rolls off our tongues and we don't think about what it really means. Or we might even call it non-objective expressionism. However, we can't get to the work of any of these three artists without exploring the contributions of Charles Hawthorne and his disciple Henry Henshey. These two were the plein air pioneers of Cape Cod. And of all the strands that we can pull from the following eras, really radiate out from what was considered a really radical practice for Hawthorne. We will create a category called plein air pre-impressionism, not post-impressionism, but pre-impressionism. Hawthorne instructed his students in an impressionist influence mode, and then Henry Henshey continued to teach in this, what was then already a conservative style. Impressionism and the plein air diaspora, if we go look at some of the plein air painting in the early 19th century in Europe, most painting out of doors was actually a serious break from the traditional habits of European painting that was dominated at the time by the salons and the academies and the painting methods, materials, and subject matter that were taught and practiced according to tried and true formulas. It was in the 1820s and 30s that European artists such as John Constable in England and the Barbizon painters of France decided to forget the formulas, find the truth in nature, and trust their own visions. This painting by Theodore Rousseau, The Edge of the Woods at Montgérard Fontainebleau Forest from 1854, is special, I think, and an important painting because the title has such a specificity of where it is located. This may not seem that important today, but in that era, the idea of saying exactly where you're painting, as opposed to calling it some classical romantic title of Lost in the Woods or something. This specificity meant that they were actually painting there. They were out of doors. They were going to these locations. Now, it doesn't mean that an artist didn't go out of doors before this, but most of the time they were drawing. They were making sketches. They weren't using paints. They weren't making colored sketches that they could then turn into more important paintings. Or in this case, not so much in Rousseau's case, because he's an earlier artist, but some of them actually turned those sketches into paintings that they sold. This painting was obviously taken back to the studio and worked done in the studio. But that specific place, actually the Fontainebleau Forest was one of the most popular early plein air locations because it was close to Paris. They painted palette and brushes in hand, creating these oil sketches outdoors. They then returned to the studio to work them up, as did Rousseau, to full-size paintings. François Millet and Gustave Courbet began creating field sketches focusing on peasant life and the natural world. This stood in contrast, direct contrast, to the practice of the established world of art, which demanded that subject matter must be based on antiquity, classical mythology, or biblical scenes. From these roots came a full-scale artistic revolution in France in the mid-19th century, fueled by the new science of optics, which had uncovered how the eye actually physically registers color. A new style of painting was born, Impressionism. In addition, the popularity of painting en plein air increased exponentially in the 1870s with the introduction of paints in tubes. Before they had paints in tubes like your toothpaste tube, artists had to make their own paints by grinding them and mixing them with linseed oil. So to be able to take things out really take painting out into the out of doors was pretty difficult. But the simple invention of tubes for paint made a big difference for these artists. And also was during this period that the box easel, typically now known as the French box easel, was invented. It is uncertain who developed it first, but these highly portable easels with telescopic legs and built-in paint box and palette made the treks into the forests and onto the beaches and up the hillsides less onerous. We're coming back to the John Singer Sargent sketching, Paul Helleu sketching with his wife from 1889, because I wanted to point out that detail again. These painters that Sargent was painting were literally going into the environment. And the French artists, when they were painting en plein air, much of their work was done out of doors in a kind of diffuse light that was provided by large white umbrellas. So they used these umbrellas to keep the sun out of their eyes, but they also found that there was this amazing light, diffuse light, that they got by using the umbrellas. Then we enter the American Impressionists, especially those who traveled to Europe and painted with the well-known European artists. The message was, paint what you actually see. And if you're going to paint what you actually see and you want to do landscapes, you have to get out of doors. Charles Hawthorne, however, did study in Europe. He did see the Impressionist work, but he was mostly impressed and passionate about French and Dutch art that was earlier. He was especially taken with the late works of Frans Hals. And what his issue was in his struggle was to combine some of this late work that he loved and that he saw in Hals with some of the Impressionist ideas. And he studied with William Merritt Chase, who also was a master American Impressionist, but he was also someone who understood that interest in Hals of Hawthorne's. The Hals painting like this one, the Regencies of Old Men's Almshouse, as much as it is a portrait, it's also filled with flat patches of color. The whites are very flat. There's not a lot of nuance in them. The outfits, the blacks are very black. They're not he wasn't trying to get that detail of the draping that was earlier in the Romantic era. And I think that Hawthorne did appeal to Hawthorne because one of the things that Hawthorne became very well known for was the technique of building up an image or a painting by using flat patches of color. So Hawthorne was interested in the Impressionists, but he had this pull back to this idea of the flatness of the canvas and the broadness of the brushstrokes, and he liked the idea of that movement on the canvas. Hawthorne served as a kind of bridge from the 19th to the 20th century. Many of his darker tonal portraits that he took from some of this earlier work won all of the Academy Prizes. And so he was very successful in the more conservative areas. But his insistence on plein air work, which he got from the Impressionists, and the importance of color theory, which he is known for, that he drew from this older work, caused him to inspire many artists who are very diverse backgrounds, like someone like Edwin Dickinson, who was a Provincetown artist, and even Hans Hofmann, who has acknowledged that Hawthorne's ideas about color did influence him. In some ways, his teaching was more progressive than his painting, but there are some images that seem to reflect directly his teaching. This is Charles Hawthorne Town View in Provincetown from around 1920. And I think you can get a sense of almost the Cézanne-like feeling of these structures, where the flatness of the brushstrokes is so obvious, and yet there's still a representational image there. So he doesn't go to the extent that someone like Hofmann would go later. He sticks with the representational image. But a painting like this really shows his experimenting with the idea of the patches of color and on the flat surface. Hawthorne said to his students, "Forget what object is before you. Think, here is an oblong of pink, a little square of blue, a streak of yellow. Paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives you an impression of the scene before you." His theory of spots of color not only connected him with the Impressionists and Cézanne, but also became the precursor to the ideas of abstract expressionism, according to Hans Hofmann. So if we got up close to these, to a painting like this, as you can with Cézanne, you would only see strokes of paint. You wouldn't see the detail of a roof line or a detail of what the window really looked like. In his later watercolors, after his trips to Europe in 1911 and 1914, he stuck close to his subject matter, But if we look at the details, we can see that there are just broad strokes and colors, very little attempt at detailed rendition. These are just strokes of color, even though you can see the house in the backyard. So he, as I said before, he had this struggle with the conservative in him who wanted to represent and believed that you had to paint what you see. But he also loved the idea of painting by color and by patches of color, and felt that his work, some of this work like this, is very fresh and spontaneous. Hawthorne struggled in his own work because he was taught in the indoor tonalist approach of the Art Students League and the National Academy of Design in the time period. And he was passionate about the painting that he saw in the Netherlands. But he struggled with the idea of how to put the two together. William Merritt Chase did help him by helping him to see that you could do something similar to this, where you're outside working in the light, using the color, but you're not necessarily painting any detail. It's the combination, truly, of what he painted with what he taught and what he demanded of his students. He wanted them to learn how to see. There were some students who saw him as a god. They came back every summer. They thought he was just, they literally talked about worshiping him. And then there were others who found him arrogant and less than helpful. Dorothy Lake Gregory actually wrote, "Mr. Hawthorne is the worst teacher I have ever seen. Too wrapped up in his own work, and his criticism isn't worth a row of beans." There were some people who felt that he was very aloof and very arrogant, but there was something about the way he struggled and the way he pushed through his ideas that seemed to force some students to open their eyes and find new ways to create. Edwin Dickinson was one of those, and he wrote that Hawthorne had an incisive exploration of color, that he espoused the era's most advanced color theory. He wrote and spoke of spots of color and of his belief that putting one spot of color next to another is the fundamental thing. He required that his students have the courage to set down the colors they see, and that form takes care of itself if the color is right. This was pretty radical stuff for this time period. And yet, he himself couldn't get beyond some of his earlier training. Hawthorne's vision did, however, free many artists to experiment. And he wasn't an artist or a teacher who wanted his students to imitate what he did. He really wanted them to go beyond and experiment. Hawthorne's way of pursuing the development of images through comparative color values was an important revelation, and it can be seen as fundamental to the growth of modern art and abstract expressionism in particular. Hawthorne's early study with Chase and the European masters did contribute to his understanding of how shadow can create form. And even his most outdoor bright scenes, Hawthorne always emphasized the shadow, the dark areas. He made those facial shadows famous. It is said that a Bostonian visitor derisively coined them mudheads for the portraits painted in the bright sun, in which the identity of the sitter and the details of the face were irrelevant, and the color patterns were foremost. Time magazine, years after his death in 1938, even had a feature called Art Mudheads, in which they explained Hawthorne's method as to how he would place a model on the beach so that the brilliant background of sky and water forced students to see the head merely as a spot of color. He then gave each student a big board-edged putty knife and a square of building board and urged them to study color rather than drawing. Painting is just getting one spot of color in relation to another spot of color, he would say. Go out like a savage, as if paint had just been invented. Don't paint thinly as a student. You are at an age when you are supposed to make mistakes. Go after some heads and paint them as hunks of flesh. According to Time, new students were often embarrassed by Boston sightseers who would come and be revolted by these featureless, formless shapes that they painted and called them mudheads. To Hawthorne, a painter's job was to show people more than they already see. And beauty in art he defined as the delicious notes of color, one against the other. It's almost luscious in the kind of color that he used. And so what is important to understand about what happened at this time in Provincetown is that it was a place of exploration for many artists, beginning with Hawthorne. There was a mighty struggle waging at the turn of the 20th century that continues in some ways now into the 21st. There was a joy and excitement about the new freedom offered by moving out of the academies and away from the strict formulas of the past centuries. There was also the desire, consistent with all creative minds and people, to find and express truth and a voice, to create something personal and individual, and yet something that would have meaning in the larger world and would stand the test of time. At the time, it was a struggle between what was understood to be photographically real and what was personally seen and felt to be real. Hawthorne was often on the conservative traditional side between the traditionalists and sometimes actually called the normals in Provincetown, and the modernists who belonged to the Provincetown Art Association. They would have exhibitions where the normals were on one side and the modernists were on the other side. There were several years of struggle in the association, beginning with discrimination against the moderns. Then there were packing of juries, and then separate juries, then separate exhibitions, and many, many lines drawn between who was normal and who wasn't. Stuart Davis came to Provincetown after he participated in the Armory Show in 1913. And he said, at the time, Provincetown still retained a considerable vestige of its seafaring past. On clear days, the air and water had a brilliance of light greater than I have ever seen. And while this tended to destroy local color, it stimulated the desire to invent high-intensity color intervals. Provincetown inspired Davis to utilize color and paint in new ways. So there was something that was going on that was stirring people up at this time. But it may actually be those who followed Hawthorne, Henry Henschel and Hans Hofmann, who saw and understood the seeds that Hawthorne had sown. And because of their own personalities, Henschel was a much easier going, more casual kind of teacher. And Hofmann was apparently always joyful no matter what happened in his own life. Because of their own personalities and their own creativity, they were able to find some kind of special inspiration in Hawthorne's teaching methods. This is Henry Henschel's Mudhead study of Helen and Bob from 1949. By that time, they were proudly wearing the title of Mudhead. But you can see he really shows how the brightness in the background creates that shadow in the face. And his faces have a little more detail in them, but this is very typical. He's kind of the quintessential mudhead painter, and he probably in some ways illustrates better the ideas that Hawthorne was trying to get across than Hawthorne himself. Henshey was the heir apparent to Hawthorne and remained faithful to Hawthorne's artistic principles and philosophy throughout his entire life. So he was stimulated and encouraged by Hawthorne, but he didn't really go beyond what Hawthorne. I've spent a little time on this Hawthorne, plein air, and the Impressionists because this is one of the strongest threads that runs through the history of art on Cape Cod. Getting outside, immersing in the out of doors, it was a breakthrough by these artists, and it fit well into Provincetown at the time and continues to fit with the environment and the experience of the Cape. The artist Romanos Risk has said and wrote in 1998, Henry Henshey, who we just talked about, this guy, was quite a rascal, ranting and raving against the qualities of the new art movements. He is one of the reasons for the continuous tradition of painting en plein air and for the favoring of impressionist techniques that still remain one of the threads of painting on Cape Cod. The other thread is that of realism. And the next person we're going to talk about is Hopper and his version of realism. Hopper came out of studying Impressionism like most of these other artists, but the French influence and the focus on what you see was very important to him. However, he also studied in New York at the New York School of Art with Robert Henry, who was one of the biggest proponents for creating a distinctly American art. He did encourage students to go abroad, but he also felt that America should have its own distinct art. When Hopper came back from France just before 1914, he painted Soir Bleu, which clearly is a French-influenced subject matter, as well as influenced by Matisse and some of the other artists, post-impressionist artists. The feeling and the mood of Soir Bleu was, in those days, called very French, because it was very removed, and this painting was exhibited when he got back, but it was kind of ignored by most American critics because of the subject matter and because of the kind of removed feel of all the people, the personalities in the images. However, this is a very early painting by Edward Hopper, and to me, it really shows some aspects of his painting that continued through his entire life, some of his very mature paintings when he was painting kind of alienated people in the city and in the country. Hopper, too, felt this deep connection to French culture from his 3 trips to Paris, 1906, 1909, and then in 1910. But he felt that he needed to play down that when he came back to America, especially by the 1920s. So he created paintings with very clear American subject matter, but he felt that they all had strong French aesthetic influences, including the tenets of Impressionism and the realist work of Manet, Degas, and Matisse. Hopper said that the influence of the French masters of the 19th century was of vital importance to American painting, and Americans could not have their own painting unless they understood and worked with and experimented with the French movements. Plein air work, watercolors in Gloucester in particular, this is Haskell's house from 1924. This is a solid, stately house portrait by Hopper. He was respected and praised for rendering this as an American house, but He was also criticized because it had a mansard French roof. And people wanted to see him render the simpler, average, modest homes, the cottages, which actually would characterize most of his work on Cape Cod. He rarely painted, after this early period, these kind of Victorian homes. He just stopped painting them and painted the more simple, economically minimalist homes. He would, these kind of watercolors that he did were done outside, and it was a way for him to use the Impressionist way of painting, using watercolor. And I think there were many artists, including the French, who felt that watercolor was a faster and more, it was an easier kind of medium to use when you were outside. By the 1930s in the United States, cultural nationalism, the regionalists, American scene, and in the government mural projects, Hopper was already seen as an American regionalist or American scene painter, but it was a title he hated. He just felt it was just not who he was. But it did bring him critical success and financial success. One of his friends and a progressive critic, Guy Pen du Bois, wrote, "No painter's import can rest so simply in that which he paints," the subject matter of what he paints. "Sometime Hopper will be recognized as a painter with very sound technical equipment and a superbly individual vision." That was somewhat prophetic, but at the time, Hopper felt kind of forced, if he was going to be successful, to paint specifically American scenes. But Hopper found his own particular passion for Cape Cod. His immersion in the Cape Cod landscape was in the more isolated places, the simple pared down scenes and architecture. He found South Truro, although he did have friends and neighbors with whom he socialized, and I know there is a kind of a myth about him being antisocial. It was his wife, Josephine Nivenson, who loved the gatherings and the connections with the other artists, and he often went along, even though it wasn't his favorite thing to do. But he did explore the Cape. He painted locations in several towns: Orleans, Easttown, Wellfleet, and Truro. This is the Camel's Hump from 1931, and it is one of two paintings from this period in which the landscape is the primary actor. There are no man-made structures or figures in this landscape, and that is fairly unusual for Hopper. The other one that he painted in this same area, the hills South Truro, where the landscape, once again, although there is a building in the foreground, the obvious focal point are the hills. And this was possibly, the people who have studied Hopper have thought that because this was an area that he loved and he was passionate about, this is where he ended up building his studio. And we have a picture of this, and that point right there is where Hopper's South Truro studio was built. It was in a fairly isolated area. Obviously, there was one other house in the area, but he built his studio up on a very high point in South Truro. Philip Koch, who's made a study of Hopper's daily life, he's a painter himself, and studied a lot about how Hopper wandered around the Cape and walked. And Philip has actually had 15 residencies in Hopper's still standing home studio up in South Truro. he's been very helpful to me in kind of trying to fill in some of the details of Hopper's fascination with the landscape and the environment. Hopper built his studio up on this kind of high dune and loved coming to it. You can see kind of the path going in this area on the left-hand side. That path is very steep and difficult to get up, and especially if you're carrying painting supplies. And Philip has wandered this area, and he's been fascinated by the difficulty and energy needed to get up these paths and to get to the cottage, to walk down to the beach from the steep cliffs, and to even get into the dunes and immerse yourself in the dunes that location provides. Hopper did not paint the obviously panoramic views of the ocean, which were clearly on the other side. He could see them every day from his studio window, and he rarely painted the ocean in that way. But he sought out and he studied locations and views in a very deliberate way to find out what spoke to him. For Koch, he's written, there was also an alluring mystery to his paintings. He paints a world where incidentals and distractions have been pared away, leaving only the most expressive shapes and color ideas. They grab hold of our eyes and our emotions. In the early years, Truro had a population of 500 people. Hopper's paintings, often depicting one house standing alone in nature, convey the remoteness and the quiet of the sparsely populated area. This area was less spoiled in Hopper's eyes than the rest of the Cape. It kept its essential character, even though some tourists and visitors come and go. John Dos Passos and his wife were neighbors of the Hoppers and friends of theirs. It was this essential character that became Hopper's subject on Cape Cod. Modern life on the Cape, as he presented it, involved a balance between the old and the new. The continued addition of new kinds of human elements on the timeless natural landscape. There's a continued fascination with the exact locations that he painted. I don't know if you've experienced this, but there's an entire tourist industry on the Cape of Hopper country, and comparing photos with paintings of what he did. This is a comparison of 36 watercolor cottages at North Truro, and Gail Levin did a photo exhibition at the Cape Cod Museum of Art a few years ago, where she took photographs of some of the sites and compared them to the actual paintings. This has become a popular kind of activity on the Cape. But it is interesting to take a look. Obviously, there's been a house built where there wasn't one when he was painting. But it is interesting to note that many of the buildings that he painted are still in existence and have been taken care of, renovated, but mostly on the inside rather than on the outside. Hopper did go for simplicity. In his personal life, his surroundings were fairly simple, bare. Personally, he never acquired many luxuries. Even when he's earning quite a bit of money, he was very determined, lived modestly and very economically. And if you, even in his studio, it was a very modestly furnished interior. So we have a feeling that he, in not only his personal life, but in his artistic life, he looked for ways to simplify and to eliminate some of the details. And he didn't go back to the Victorian houses with all the extra details on them. This is another comparison with the Highland Light photograph. Highland Light is out also in the Truro area. And the light was standing, obviously, a little bit differently. It had some more outbuildings when he painted it. But he was, as you can see, not so interested in just the light itself, the lighthouse, but in all of the buildings and the flat surfaces and the geometry of all of those roofs and walls. That was kind of what fascinated him, how the light and the shadows created those geometric shapes in the buildings. He didn't focus on the drama of the lighthouse and the ocean below. He focused on the flat buildings and the geometry of them. Rendering the particular effects of light, he did write that he had always been interested in the light, and more so than he felt most other contemporary artists. And this was somewhat due to his debt to Impressionism and to getting out in the sun and the light. This is one of my favorite paintings by Edward Hopper, House on Pamet River, which, if you know Cape Cod, Pamet River is a beautiful area. But he didn't paint the Pamet River. He didn't paint that landscape that so many artists have painted. He painted the house sitting on the river, and he painted it up front in your face with all of these amazing geometrical patterns. And I think that he was looking for motifs and areas that really fascinated him. And even though we think of him as this, the quintessential lighthouse painter, and many people try to paint like Hopper. We've even had an exhibition last year called After Hopper. There was just something special about his vision and how he chose to paint what he painted. There were probably amazing views around this house, and this is how he decided to paint. He was especially interested in architectural structures. Ellen Roberts, who wrote the MFA catalog from 2007 on Edward Hopper, said Hopper explored the formal relationship between the strict rectilinearity of the architecture and the organic part of the surrounding nature. The landscape of Cape Cod was also distinct. Its sandy soil supported few trees, so that the countryside was open, covered with sand and tall timothy grass that turned golden brown in the high summer. You don't have a lot of trees around these kind of houses that block the geometry and the structure of the building. And I think that's why he chose some of these particular buildings. The simplification of building shapes into geometric abstractions, it was an increasingly formalist approach which Hopper took to his subjects, but he would always deny it. He didn't want to have anything to do with the idea of abstraction. He didn't like the word. He didn't like the idea that he was an abstractionist. He apparently chose to paint buildings like this, not so much for their beauty, but for their forms, for the fascinating way that they related to each other. And that is an abstract sensibility, but he tried to deny that whenever people would talk to him or bring that to his attention. Many critics did see his work as an effective combination of realism and abstraction. His geometric patterns related to cubism, but his sensibilities seemed more akin to Cézanne and the earlier painters, the post-impressionists, interested in the light. His pictures evoke the sense of the houses as they exist in nature, defined by the sunlight and the shade. They're not flat and hard-edged the way the abstract expressionists would present them. These houses are embraced by their surroundings. They're nestled in, cozy in their surroundings. We'll see in a few minutes that Blanche Lazell, who had some of the same influences and interacted with some of the same artists, took that abstraction to a very different level, to a more hard-edged level. I think we're getting... So I am going to talk a little bit about this final painting by Hopper in 1963, Sun in an Empty Room. And this is probably one of his most abstract paintings toward the end of his life. And it's just quintessentially an image of light and shade and his own surroundings around him. I would like to say a few words about Blanche Lazell and her Cubist-Phobist realism. She was a modernist, a female modernist, one of the first artists to travel back and forth to Paris and to Europe, and to bring back with her the color theories of the Fauves and the Cubists. Her work, this early work from 1918 and 19, is clearly influenced by the Fauves and those bright colors that they used. A little bit later, when she became part of the Provincetown printers and worked in the white line printmaking area, she flattened her images, she flattened her structures, and really used the theories more from the Cubists than from the Post-Impressionists. Blanche Lazell, this is her painting after she went back to France and actually worked with Albert Glaise, who was an abstractionist. And this is what I mean about the hard edges of this kind of abstraction, very different from Hopper and very much almost non-objective, even though she claims that that was actually a still life in there. But she didn't do this for very long. She came back to Provincetown and she created more white line prints that are very flat and very cubist, but not non-objective. They're all related to things that she saw. This is probably the most abstract, after she actually studied with Hofmann around the time she turned 60. She was always looking for new things to experiment and to look at and to integrate into her painting. This is Dunes in Autumn, and was probably one of the most abstract things that she did, but it's still clearly about a place and a time. This is a beautiful color woodblock print from that late period, and I want to compare it with this painting, which is actually in the Cape Cod Museum of Art collection, a watercolor on paper from 1933. It's a bit of a mystery to me, this painting. I love it, but I have always wondered where this particular color and composition came from. And it's called Abstract Long Point, and Long Point was a lighthouse off the coast or at the end of the spit of Provincetown. And I am wondering if perhaps that structure, black structure, is her way of illustrating that bell tower. On the other hand, it could be related to this pile driver image that she, and obviously when you're a cubist or a post-impressionist, you're not necessarily sticking directly with what you see. I do think that the rocky shore line is definitely part of what she captured in the lower part of the painting. But it's an interesting painting, and I'm kind of fascinated by it. I often pair it with this John Joseph Enneking as a lesson in the museum about how artists see things differently, even though the images and the subject matter is kind of the same. And then we can add the Hans Hofmann landscape that obviously has water in it and land in it, and some of the same colors. And think about how we, in American art, went from Impressionism through to abstract expressionism. And I am very sorry, but I am over my time. But I think this is actually a good place to stop, because I think this shows that sometimes you can look at the same images and have the same experiences, and artists will interpret them in their own ways from their own, both their aesthetic ideas, but also their experience in the landscape itself. Thank you so much.
Well, I think we have time for one, maybe two very quick questions. And if you have a question that warrants a longer answer, perhaps we can do that in person after. So if there are any quick questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Well, thank you very much for coming. We'll see you back here next week for architecture.